Okay, okay, folks, I'm recording. So let's let's pretend that we are on the BBC and let's speak and write properly. So welcome to another Research Methods lecture. Today we are going to try to put a research proposal together. I have already been I spent 2 hours before the lecture doing that. So what I did was for the sake of having something easy to do, I just got a paper, a recent working paper of myself, which is forthcoming in the Oxford University Press handbook of the South African economy. So I think it's going to be out this November. So they asked me, the editors, they asked me to write a chapter on public debt in South Africa. Probably because I wrote a couple of papers in the past from a political economy perspective on public debt in South America. So what I did was I essentially, using the framework or the template that we have already discussed, I think a long time ago, weeks 1 and 2, using that template, I put some ideas together. So let me share my screen with you. Let me see which one is the right one. Okay. Okay, folks. That's not actually the screen I want to share. No, it can be that one. Okay. So where is the screen I want to share? Here it is. Okay. Okay, folks. As you probably know, I don't use Microsoft Word. I use Scientific Workplace, which is a similar program, but it's slightly different because it gives me more resources, and also because when I was a PhD student, that's the one I learned to use. So this is not the final version of the report. Let me stop sharing. That's not the one I want to share. Wait a moment. Give me 1 second. Okay. Just trying to find the right screen. Ah, it's down here. Okay. There we go. Okay. The first thing, folks, when you submit your research proposal, and the same goes with your the referee report, and also it goes with any document that you have to submit, right, folks? Always make sure that you save your document as a PDF file. First of all, it looks better, and second, if you submit a Word document, anyone can actually change what you have written in a Word document. Okay, and it is much more professional to submit a PDF file. So that's the first page of the proposal. It's a proposal on public debt in South Africa. That's the title of the chapter that I mentioned before. That is my name. You don't need to put Mr., Mrs., or Ms., or doctor, or professor, or whatever you have in mind. You just put your name there. unless you are a bit low in self-confidence. And if you are a professor of economics at the University of Pretoria, then you put Professor Bittencourt. But given that I have no problems with self-confidence, I just put my name, and that's my advice to you as well. Just put your name there, and you just put your affiliation. That in this case is the Department of Economics at the University of Pretoria, and also the date that you are submitting whatever you are submitting. Okay, that is all that is needed for page 1. Do not put flowers or little house or a little dog or a cat or a rat or a bunny, whatever, flowers, nothing. Just the title, your name, your affiliation, and the date. Okay. Yeah, I know. I know, Dennis. You might find that funny, but that happens quite a lot. Okay. It's not only wrong, but it's also tacky, and not only tacky, but also wacky. So no, just what is in there, just what you are seeing there. Okay. And then what you need is an abstract. So that's one page. Let me maximize this a little bit. It's an abstract of your proposal. Okay. We kind of already know what to put in an abstract, right? We've been seeing lots of abstracts in macroeconomics and also in research methods. And what do I put there? Well, after 4 decades of racial segregation, right? It's a little bit of motivation, a little bit. The first sentence there is essentially motivation, right? After 4 decades of racial segregation, South Africa transitioned to a non-racial democracy in 1994. So this transition makes South Africa an interesting place to study, because there is always the before and the after 1994. Okay, so there are lots of things which were different before 1994 and which changed in 1994. Lots of things which haven't changed yet, but a lot of things changed. Okay, so that is just a little bit of motivation, and recall, this is just a proposal. You don't know yet your results. Okay, you are proposing to study a particular subject. And then I go and I put, inevitably, for a country with segregationist labor market policies for so long. So that's the whole point as economists, right? Every time we talk apartheid, for us, it's not the typical image that when I was a kid, you don't remember that because it's before you were born, back in the 1980s. But when I was a kid in the 80s, a teenager in the 80s, and I would be watching the news at home, and I would see those images, which was essentially a white policeman with a German Shepherd chasing black people. Right, and no wonder black South Africans are not really very keen on German Shepherds, and I am not very keen on German Shepherds. I'm Jewish. I cannot be very keen on German Shepherds, right? So, but for us economists, apartheid is essentially about discrimination in the labor market, right? And the consequences of that. Okay, so inevitably, for a country with segregationist labor market policy for so long, South Africa is also, consequence now, one of the most unequal countries in the world. Right? Again, because we don't know yet, this is a research proposal. So there is an element that you really have to motivate your subject a little bit. So there are 2 sentences in there about motivation of why, in this case, South Africa is an interesting country to study, right? So what do we do in order to take an overview of government debt in South Africa, or how government debt has been behaving or evolving over time before and after 94, right? I look at macroeconomic performance. Macroeconomic performance is essentially 2 variables, usually 2 variables, growth and inflation, but also at how the political regime characteristics and inequality have interplayed with government debt using using time series data covering the 1970-2016 period. So, folks, there are 3 sentences in this abstract. 2 sentences are, sentence number 1 there is about motivation. Sentence number 2 is about motivation. And then there is a sort of long sentence where I say what I'm planning, proposing to do, and how I'm planning to do that. So I'm proposing to study not only the role of macroeconomic performance on government debt in South Africa, but also the role of the political regime characteristics, such as apartheid, or a regime which had less democracy. And then the break in 1994, and then there is the start of this non-racial democracy in 1994. Okay, and how those 2 regimes affected somehow the behavior of government debt in South Africa. And for that, I'm going to use macroeconomic data, which is essentially time series data covering the 1970-2016 period. As I said, I don't know what's going to happen, right? In the abstract, because this is a proposal, there is nothing about the results in there. Okay. I also put some keywords. Where are these keywords coming from? Well, folks, the keywords, they come from the title, Public Debt in South Africa. So the keywords cannot come from any other place. The keywords usually, mostly, all the time, always come from the title. So keywords, debt, South Africa. Okay. And then the Journal of Economic Literature codes. I got these codes. Let me stop sharing now. Let me share a different screen if I can find it here. Here it is. The codes, they come from if you go to my web page, I have already showed you that, but I'm going to do it again. If you go to resources, right? Resources for graduate students. You are in between, right? An undergraduate and a graduate degree. Honors is not really an undergraduate anymore, but it's not really a graduate degree either. Honors, in fact, just a little bit of general knowledge for you. Honors is really, it illustrates well the role of institutions and how institutions, how persistent institutions can be. So I studied in England, right? England is one of the nations of the United Kingdom. It's, when we usually associate the English with okay, I don't want to go in there, but I studied in England, and in England there is no honors degree, right? So, but if you cross the border into Scotland, then there is something called the 4th year or the honors degree. So essentially, the honors degree is it comes also recall a couple of things. South Africa was a colony of the United Kingdom. And although we tend to blame the English for everything, but in fact, the civil servants of the empire in Africa, they were mostly Scottish, and therefore they implemented the Scottish educational system in former African colonies. And that's what we have here. We don't have the UK system, we don't have the English system, we have the Scottish educational system. That's why we have something called honors. So we just go to my resources page on my web page, and you find there American Economic Association's resources. I have already been there, and then in resources you find GEL codes guide. You press there, you find the GEL classification codes guide. And then this paper is on what? Well, this paper is on public debt. Essentially, this paper is on public economics, right? The proposal of this for this paper is a paper on which is going to be on public economics, and there you can find all the different fields of economics, right? And down there are more fields, right? Health, labor, law, industrial, IO. This particular one is on public economics, and then you find I think I put HO, which is general public economics. Then I put also I think I put H63, which is debt management, sovereign debt. So you find what you want to find, the code which is more appropriate to describe your future paper. There we go again. So I put H0, H41, and H63. So they are all in the H category, which is essentially public economics. Okay, because I'm covering this with you, I expect you to do exactly as I am telling you to do. Okay, folks, it's the first time we are working together. Usually in the past, I would have already taught most of you in EKN 325, but that was not the case now. So I think it's always a good idea to follow my instructions pretty much to the letter. Okay. So I'm covering this. I'm expecting those things in your proposal. What else we have to do? So public debt in South Africa is up there. What is the purpose, right? This is the template, the format that I gave you in weeks 1 and 2 back in March. What's the purpose of this? The first thing that you have to put in your proposal is the purpose. What is the purpose? What is that you want to do? What is the research question? So the purpose in bold of this paper is to understand public debt dynamics in South Africa. So that's already in the title. It's so simple, but we need more than that, right? So I write there also. The starting point is, as always, with this particular literature, with debt, how macroeconomic performance, say economic growth and inflation, affect or don't affect government debt. That's the first thing I will investigate in the chapter, or in this case in the paper. In addition, in bold paragraphs, in order to get a more nuanced picture of debt in South Africa, I also take a look at the role. You don't have to say I also take a look, because you already have in addition there. I take a look at the role of democracy on government debt, or the role of political regime characteristics on government debt. So I look at whether the political regime in place in South Africa, which includes periods of less democracy, transition, and universal democracy, has had any effect on government debt. Why is this interesting, folks? Right? I'm going to motivate the subject later on, but why is this interesting? Well, because with democracy, there is something called the median voter theorem, which says that political parties in power, they will always try to satisfy the median voter, right? And the median voter until 1994 was one person, and the median voter after 94 changed completely. So the political party in power before and after will try to satisfy different median voters, right? So the median voter until 1994 had different needs than the median voter after 1994. So that's why there is a very rich literature dealing with that. And then there is the period of 1990 until 1994. It's the period between when Mandela is out of prison until the first non-racial universal elections. That is considered to be a sort of transition. Okay. Furthermore,
Some will argue, that's nice, right? Some will argue that young democracies, such as the 26 years old South African democracy, mature over time, right? That is to say, with time, the electorate learned the nuts and bolts of the democratic game and forced governments to behave more responsibly in terms of debt creation, right? So we are a very young democracy, and there is very little democratic capital in South Africa. There is very little experience with democracy in South Africa, right? It's very young, it's a young democracy. In other words, with democratic maturity, the electorate become less myopic and ends up forcing, by punishment in the polls, governments to minimize overspending before elections. So it's quite common in democracies, right? That governments usually they don't do anything for 3 years, and then on the year before the election they start doing lots of things, right? And you see kind of shoddy, brand new shoddy buildings around, etc., etc. So that is a very rich literature dealing with political cycles, and I am proposing to also include that in this paper. Moreover, some will argue that with the release of Mandela from prison in 1990, the transition towards universal democracy was inevitable, right? It was inevitable. De Klerk came in essentially to dismantle the regime and therefore announced in advance. So everybody knew, right, that elections, universal elections were coming. So what do? I look at whether during the last 40 years of the National Party in power, they engaged in activities such as widespread conspicuous consumption, which would leave the new political coalition with a considerable amount of debt to be repaid in the initial stages of the new democratic regime in 1994. So in 1990, with the release of Nelson Mandela from prison, it was inevitable. A fully fledged democratic regime was going to happen, right? And if the National Party knew that they wouldn't get reelected, right, with non-racial elections, well, they would have the incentive to start overspending because they wouldn't have to pay the bill, right? The debt would mature only after they had left government. So they would. It's a very interesting. It's a very interesting question to investigate, right? In addition, increases in government debt might be due to the relative high income inequality seen in South Africa and the need for redistribution to the median voter. So assuming, we don't know yet, I already know because I wrote the paper, it's done, but the ANC would have or any political party coming into power in 1994, they would have very different incentives, or their electorate would be very different than the national party's electorate, right? And because the inequality was high, the political party coming into power in 1994, they would have to start spending more in any event. Okay, and that would have an effect on that. So complementary to that, it can be that democracy, when in its infancy, faces ideological opposition. Again, this, folks, is very common, right? It's not compulsory to believe in democracy. Some people don't believe in democracy. Period. Right? So democracy, the new regime would face ideological opposition, and therefore the new regime tries to buy out the electorate by provision of public goods, such as education and health. So that democracy becomes ideologically acceptable and the only game in town. Right? I look into how public goods provision, redistribution, such as education and health, blah, and then I blah, 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 affect public debt before and after 94. So those are essentially it's one research question, but the the question is so rich, and with very little data, you can do a lot, right? And that's the cleverness of this. You don't need a lot of data to do a paper, to do a chapter in this case, or to do a report. With little data, if you are smart, you can do quite a lot. There are increasing returns to scale. So that's the purpose, right? What is that you are going to do? You see, there is there are no references there. There is no literature review there. Okay, it's just essentially the research question and the ramifications, the possible ramifications that you can do within the same research question. Okay, folks, let me stop here to see if there are questions. Questions, comments? All clear? All clear? One clear. I need 3 clears. 2 clears. Okay. Okay. Lots of clears. Okay. Let me continue sharing. Okay. So that is the first, let's say, section or subsection of the proposal. Wait a moment. Meaning, when writing the proposal part, we shouldn't include literature review. No, we are going to see that now, right? Yes, the purpose of your paper. No, you don't mention anything at this stage. Okay, you are going to mention that later on. Okay. It's just essentially just your research question and the ramifications. What is that you can do with that research question? Because you see, folks, the purpose essentially is here, is in one sentence. The purpose of this paper is to understand public debt dynamics in South Africa, and then you start the ramifications, right? And as I said, just to reinforce, let me see chat. Okay. Just to reinforce, there are no references at this stage. No reference at this stage. Okay. Okay. Section 1.2, motivation. So now is why is this research question important, or why is this research question worthwhile studying? What's so important about that? So let's see how I go about this. And then I say again, after 4 decades of official racial segregation, South Africa transitioned to a non-racial democracy in 1994 when the first universal elections took place, right? And although, and that I think that's a kind of nice sentence, because there is a counterfactual here, right? And although South Africa didn't present some of the macroeconomic maladies that other young democracies did shortly after their own democratic transitions, that is to say, and at this level, you always have to say, right? You are stating something. And although South Africa didn't present some of the macroeconomic maladies that other young democracies did shortly after their own democratic transition, that is to say, high government debt and hyperinflation, right? South Africa didn't have that. Inevitably, for a country that presented in one way or another segregationist labor market policies until 1994, South Africa has also presented relatively high levels of income inequality with a Gini coefficient of 63.02, right? That's if you know a little bit of income inequality and how it's measured, this Gini coefficient here is pretty high, okay? Meaning that a few people at the top, they get a lot of the disposable income in the country. I cite Milanovic here, but you don't need to cite anyone at this stage either. Okay. The above background, that is to say, racial segregation. Now we put everything together, right? Racial segregation, transition to democracy, and high inequality allows me to borrow from a rich and diverse body of literature so that I can draw a clearer picture of government debt dynamics in South Africa. Because folks, what usually is done is people just use growth and inflation or macroeconomic performance to understand debt dynamics in South Africa. But that doesn't give you it gives you some idea, but it doesn't give you the nuances, right? The apartheid, how the apartheid regime behaved, how the democratic regime behaved, how was the transition. It excludes, it misses the point. Well, it misses a lot of stuff, right? And what I want here, what I'm proposing here is to get a clearer picture, right? A clearer picture of government debt dynamics in South Africa. So I start from the usual canonical way of understanding government debt, but then I go a little bit further than that. Okay. So there is a lot of motivation for this subject. So there is different regimes, different political regimes, different median voters. There was a transitional period. There is a lot of inequality. So there is a lot of there is a different ways that you can motivate a particular subject. Why is this exercise of looking at the data relevant, informative for a better understanding of the recent South African debt dynamics? It's still motivation, right? It's a long paragraph, folks, but you can just create paragraphs. Firstly, why is this also important? Apart from apartheid, transition, democracy, different median voters, right? Inequality. Apart from all that dynamics, right? That can tell us so much. Well, firstly, the growth literature suggests that large governments tend to be detrimental to economic activity, right? This is because government consumption tends to play little constructive role on private productivity. There is borrowed there. I'm not going to explain to you the economics, right? I think we are having we kind of understand, right? We had Ramaphosa, the president, telling us yesterday all those interesting details of corruption. Needless to say that it all depends on what governments do with the debt created, right? The debt itself is not the problem, but it's really what you do with the debt that you are creating. For instance, education and health tend to be seen as productive investment, which feeds into ideas and economic growth. And then I cite Colin and David Weil there. Government wastefulness, on the other hand, tends to have the opposite effect on prosperity. More on that later. More on that later. You don't need that. Just cut it. Secondly, public choice theory suggests that higher government spending tends to reduce subjective life satisfaction. And this reduction in life satisfaction happens when governments maximize their own well-being by favoring particular interest groups. Again, what we are witnessing is very much about the government satisfying particular interest groups for 10 years. And this misallocation of resources tends to be detrimental to general well-being. Well, if you are satisfying just one group and you have lots of groups, then you are in detriment of general well-being, right? And life satisfaction. And then there is a paper there. by Christian, Axel, and Justina. And with the benefit of writing the previous sentence in November 2020, so here I'm taking this is straight from the chapter, right? So, but with the benefit of writing the previous sentence in April 2021, it seems always a very diplomatic way of putting things, that unproductive government spending and the role of interest groups have been high on the recent political and economic agenda in South Africa. And then I cite Tully's report. Okay, so that is motivation. Why is this subject important, right? Why is this subject interesting? What makes this subject? Is it a dead subject? Is it a dead? Is there a dead end there? Has it been? Why? And then here is essentially a little bit on the history of South Africa, right? The first paragraph. I'm just recapping the whole thing. A little bit on the history, apartheid, transition, democracy, different median voters, excessive inequality. All societies have some sort of inequality, but South Africa is excessive, and that opens different avenues within this literature, right? And then also, why is this important? Why it's important also to understand government debt? Well, because we know from the literature that governments which large governments, they tend to be detrimental to general well-being, right? And then you explain a little bit of the economics behind the intuition, as I do there. Let me stop sharing this stage and see. Let me see if there is questions. So there is, what is the difference when you have in addition, furthermore, etc.? Is it you motivating, or no? It's just me playing with words, right? But you shouldn't do that. Okay, you can use furthermore and furthermore and furthermore, right? It's just me playing with words. Any other question or comment? Essentially, Nokutula, to answer your question, is it's just me bullshitting. You shouldn't do that, right? But sometimes I can't control myself, and I become a bullshitter. So, but thanks for bringing that to my attention. Questions, comments up to this point? All clear? Oh, there is one new message down there. Okay. Any all clear up to this point? Okay. It's water. As I said to you, in my previous institution, I cracked a joke, and there was a complaint. But given that I'm not on campus, so I could be drinking beer or wine. I'm not on campus, right? And I'm paying from my pocket for the bundles, even recording this today. Okay, let me share the screen again, folks, and let's continue with this. Okay. Now, folks, the next section is the literature review. Okay, and I didn't just copy it and paste it, my literature review, because then it would be kind of I would be self-plagiarizing. Yeah. But here is where you use some of the skills being learned in research methods and also in macroeconomics. You have to cite recall 5-6 major papers in the literature. How do you cite them? How do you do this? Well, you know by now, from a paper, you have to know what is that they do, the research question. You get that from the abstract, usually is the second sentence of the abstract. How do they do that? What does it mean? Well, you also get that from the third sentence from the in the abstract. It's essentially the method and the data they use and what they find. Where did you get this from? You also get that from the abstract, right? It's usually the last sentence of the abstract. What they find is essentially the results, the findings. In this case, folks, I have to cite the classical papers by Robert Barrow from Harvard, Barrow 1979 in JPE. It's not gray literature, it's a paper in JPE, very highly influential paper. I also have to cite a couple of papers by Bill Easterly from NYU. Again, this is not gray literature. Those are classical papers. There is a paper by Hall and Sargent. Well, they are top in what they do. And there is also a paper by Eisenman and Marion in the Journal of Macroeconomics. Right. You have also to cite the paper by Brender and Drazen, 2005. You also have to cite the papers by Akhmedov and Zuravskaya in QJE, papers by Persson and Svensson and Alesini Tabellini. So these are all essentially, folks, the different ramifications of the research question, right? This is essentially macroeconomic performance. This is the role of democracy. This is the role of political cycles. Persson and Svensson, Alesini and Tabellini, they do also the cycles. And then Meltzer, Richard, 1981 is the classical paper on the median voter, right? And the others are important papers on the median voter literature as well. Okay. So what you are going to do here is you start by saying that this subject follows the line of an important and influential body of literature, which is illustrated by Barrow, 1979, and he does this and he does like that, and he finds this, and Easterly the same, and Hall and Sargent the same. I'm going to show you my own paper later on so that you can see exactly how it goes. And then, folks, you also need a final paragraph after you review this literature, after you show to me, in this case, that you are aware of the literature. And not only that you are aware of the literature, but that you are also aware of that you are avoiding gray literature, that you are really citing important papers in the subject. I'm highlighting there the 5-6 major papers in the subject, right? So you are showing that you know what the papers are, the major papers. You are also showing that you know how to avoid gray literature. And you are also showing me that you know what to get from a paper, which is essentially the research question of this paper, the data and method, and the results. Okay, and then you write a final paragraph where you insert your proposal, your prospective paper, into this literature. So, and then a final paragraph stating how you intend to add, and this is key really, how you intend to add to this literature. That is to say, what is that you are doing that hasn't been done yet, right? Is it because you are doing South Africa and the previous studies using South African data, they were boring and unproductive and conducted by people from Stellenbosch? I don't know. You have to come up. It's your paper. It's your subject, right? You have to tell us how is that you are adding to this literature. Is it your research question? Is it different? Is slightly different than the previous papers?
Is it the data that is different? The method is probably not going to be different, but is it the data? You are using a different variable that captures something better? You have to tell us how is that you are adding to this literature, because otherwise people will think that you are just plagiarizing, that you are essentially replicating a paper which already exists, and that is plagiarism. Okay. So let me stop sharing here to see if there are questions. All clear? Questions, comments, suggestions? All good? Okay. 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 Then the next section is methodology and data, right? You can write data and methodology if you want. Okay, I just wrote methodology, but you can write data and method. In order to get an overview of the interplay, that's a good word, interplay amongst government debt, macro performance, political regime characteristics, and inequality, I use national time series data from South Africa, covering the 1970-2016 period, right? And then I get some correlations, plot some graphs. You don't need that at this stage, okay? You don't need that that sentence at this stage. So essentially here in this sentence, I'm telling the reader how I'm going to do this, but in very general terms. And as I said, you don't need this one at this stage. Okay. Specifically, for most variables, the data used covered the 1970-2016 period. This is a particularly rich period in the recent South African history. It includes periods of some economic growth. When I came to South Africa was growing at 5%, so it wasn't so bad. That was in 2007, and I say early 2000s, less growth. Early 1990s, South Africa wasn't growing at all in the early 1990s because of the political instability and the sanctions. Some inflation, early 1980s, less inflation, 2003 onwards, less democracy, 1970 and 1990, and political instability, the 1980s, political transition, 1990-1993, universal democracy, 1994 onwards, and persistently rising inequality, right? So I'm just very briefly, right, folks? I am just very briefly, in one sentence, describing the data. Okay, and now, and here is an important thing. I already have the data, and when you submit this research proposal, ideally you also going to have some data. You don't need to have the whole your whole data set, but ideally you already have your Y variable and your X variable, the main X variable. Okay, so because that's how I'm going to mark also your proposal. If you are a student who already have the data, you already collected the data, you've been working quite nicely, you have your data, you calculated the descriptives, you have already been plotting your data, it's good, it's good. But then there is another student who has been doing a little, right? I can compare, I can see who is who. Okay, and then obviously that the guy who has been working, he's gonna get, let's say, I don't know, 74%, I don't know, 71. And the guy who I can see that has been doing little or nothing, this guy is gonna get, I don't know,
41. I don't know. One of those strange numbers, right? So, and then what I do here, folks, is I am describing the data. The variable for government debt, which I call gov debt. And then I explain the definition is the ratio of general government public debt to GDP. And the source from the historical public debt database provided by the IMF and compiled by these people there. Okay, that's an IMF working paper. And then I explain again, and general government debt includes central, state, and local governments. And then I motivate a little bit. Given my purposes in this chapter, in this paper, this data set and its extensive coverage over time, it's a very interesting data set. It's convenient because it allows me to check the role of macro performance on debt and also the difference, if any, between a less democratic regime and a fully fledged democracy in terms of government debt dynamics in South Africa. Okay. So that is my main variable, isn't it? That's the variable I'm trying to understand, to explain. And then comes my first variable, my first X variable for macro performance. For real income per capita, which I call income, and economic growth, which I call growth, I use data from the World Bank. And data on inflation is provided by the World Bank as well. Folks, we don't really need to define what is income per capita and economic growth, right? That's why I'm not defining those things here. And we don't need to define inflation either. We kind of know that. But I explain government debt, what it includes, because that's the usual question that people will be asking. But what does it include? Your debt variable, right? And so that's important. So you also need to have this feeling what is important and what is not important, right? If you start defining income per capita and economic growth and inflation, then you start delving into textbook material. Okay. Democracy or political regime characteristics, I use the polity2 variable, which I call polity from the polity4 database, which is the difference, and then I explain because it's not something obvious, which is the difference between the mock and autalk indicators compiled by polity4. These indicators contain information on the it's important I'm explaining this variable because it's not obvious, right? Information on the competitiveness and openness of executive recruitment, competitiveness of political participation, and constraints on the executive. Although the polity variable ranges from -10 to 10, with higher numbers indicating more democracy. So 10, the United States is 10, right? The United Kingdom is 10. And probably North Korea is -10. If I remember well, South Africa is 7 or 8. Okay, and then you can ask me, why is South Africa not 10? Well, you should tell me. You should tell me that. But essentially, South Africa is not 10 because since 1994 we have had the same political party in power, so there has been no change of power yet. Okay. And that is an important way. It's an important way of measuring how democratic societies are. So the United States, there was a lot of instability, a lot of strange stuff happening there until January, but there is a new president in power. In South Africa, we haven't had that moment of that turnover yet. Okay. Once we have that, if that happens one day and it goes according to the book, according to the constitution, then probably South Africa will jump to 10. Okay. And then I write something there. A positive polity correlation with government debt suggests that more democratic regimes are associated with higher debt. So I'm kind of telling the reader that comes from the literature review. right, that I do above. So the prediction from the literature is that the democracies, they tend to spend more than autocracies, right? Because they are always trying to satisfy the median voter. And the more equal a society is, the more people we have in the middle, right? And more median voters we have. Then what else I do? I also use information from Polity4 database of when South Africa transitioned to universal democracy to construct a dummy variable, which I call DMOC, that captures the whole democratic period, a procedure which is in line with Persvorsky and colleagues, and Papaiwan and Siriunis, 2008 dichotomous classifications. South Africa gets 1 from 94 onwards with zeros elsewhere. So South Africa became a democracy, so in 94, so it gets 1 from 94 onwards. That's how dummies work. Given that the dummy DMOC accounts for the whole democratic period, a positive DMOC correlation with government debt suggests that universal democracy is associated with higher debt. Okay. Again, I am giving you the prediction coming from the literature review. Moreover, using information from the Polity4 database, again, I construct a variable which counts the number of years since the transition to universal democracy has happened, right? Because remember, there is a prediction which says that more democratic societies, governments tend to be more responsible. Although South Africa entered a period of transition into democracy in 1990, South Africa transitions to universal democracy in 1994, which I consider year 1. And then I count all the way to 2016, which is year 23, with zeros elsewhere, right? That was pretty clever. I'm very creative with data. In this case, a negative and significant MDMOC correlation with government debt suggests that debt decreases as democracy gets older, or alternatively, that democracy or the electorate mature over time. Or to put it another way, it depends on your vocabulary here, governments become more responsible and efficient when creating debt or constraint with a less myopic electorate and better checks and balances in place. Okay. I did a good job there. Let me have some water. And I go on explaining my data, still using information from Polity4 database. I then construct a dummy variable for the last 4 years of apartheid, which I call apart end, with ones between 1990 and 1993 and zeros elsewhere. Right. A positive and significant apart-end correlation with government debt suggests that F.W. de Klerk government generated higher debt, that which would be partly inherited by the new democratic coalition coming into power in 1994. So, though again, I'm explaining how I am constructing variables, but you see, I am actually, I collected a particular number of variables and I am constructing more variables given the information of previous variables, right? You don't have to do that, folks, right? Honors is less than a chapter in a book, okay? You don't have to do that, but I felt I had to show you that because then you are being exposed to how things are done. Okay, let me stop sharing here and see. On the literature review, are the 3-4 top authors in my field of research part of the 5-6 guys who? Yes, absolutely. That's what we are talking about. Okay, the 3 or 4 top guys in your field are not the same 5 or 6 guys I'm mentioning, but it's your field have your 5 or 6 guys. My field have my 5 or 6 guys, and so on and so forth. Okay. Okay, more questions, more comments? All clear? All clear. I need more clears. Come on, guys. Are you still there? I still only have 29 students. Okay, clear. Okay. Very good. Okay, clear. Okay, let me go now. Still there. Very good. Proud of you guys. Okay, and now what I also find interesting, interesting in your proposal is if you can come up with something like stylized facts. Okay, that would really be a plus. If you manage to do that, then you are really sending the signal that you are already that you already have your data set and that you are already working on your data set, that you are already exploring your data set. That is a very good signal, right? If you do that, you get, I'm sure you're going to get 76%. Okay. You can clearly see that I'm a tough marker. Huh? So you can come up, and that's a subsection. It's 1.4.1, right? It's a subsection of data and method. Okay. So it can be a subsection of data and method. So stylized facts to illustrate, go straight to the point, folks. Figure 1 depicts government debt, which is my main dependent, dependent variable, right? Income per capita, inflation, and the political regime characteristics in South Africa during the 1970-2016 period, right? Those are the main variables. Income per capita in inflation. Well, you can get growth, right, from income per capita, but I don't need growth at this stage. So you have income per capita, you have inflation, which is essentially the variables proxy for macroeconomic performance. You have government debt, which is my Y variable, and then we have political regime characteristics, which is essentially democracy or less democracy. Okay, those are the main variables. Everything else, all the dummies that I construct are based on the information coming from the political regime characteristics. Okay. Interestingly enough, that's nice, right? Interestingly enough, although the data depicts is the right word. Okay, folks. An increase in debt from 2009 onwards. Interesting, right? That's an interesting year. In all, government debt has been hovering around 40% of the GDP throughout the period. So now, folks, I am essentially describing my data. Okay, I'm looking at the data. I'm going to show you the graph. I put the graph on this mock proposal. I am showing you the data and I'm describing the data. Okay, to be clear, it's not that there has been no variation. There has been variation, right? So you need data sets with variation. But that South Africa has not experienced changes in debt as dramatic as other developing countries, for instance, Brazil. So if you are saying, that's important also in the way you write, if you are saying that South Africa has not experienced changes in debt as dramatic as other developing countries, then you have to tell me which developing country. I am telling you Brazil, right? 33% Brazil, 33% of GDP of the GDP in 1980, and above 100% of the GDP in 1989. Right, you see a lot of variation in Brazilian debt. And then to internationally compare, South Africa debt was 50% of the GDP in 2015, compared to 46% for the G20 emerging countries, and 91% for the G20 advanced countries in 2015. So you can see here we are just describing. There is no judgment. You are just describing. Okay, but if you had to say something, it's quite interesting. I didn't want to say anything, but if you, as for information, for your information, you can see that developed countries, they spend a lot, right? They spend 91% of the GDP. It's a share, right? They spend more than developing countries. Obviously, they spend more because they spend more on health and education. Okay, and infrastructure. There are no blackouts there or load shedding. In sum, government debt in South Africa is not much higher than G20 emerging countries and lower than government debt in developed countries. Okay, and then I mention guys there. Okay. The second, and it says here my internet connection is unstable, so let's wait. Okay. The second and third panels depict real income and inflation, and now I'm going to describe what is in the plot. Income in the 1980s suffered considerable losses, which coincide with the second oil shock and the political instability and the international sanctions due to apartheid. Right? No political statements. It's just coincides, right, with particular events that took place for sure back in the 1980s. It has been on the rise, however, since the early 1990s, which coincides with the emergence of full democracy. It's just that it coincides. Okay, and inflation after the international macroeconomic instability of the 1970s, the oil shock, the second oil shock, in early 1980s, due to the two oil shocks, okay, I'm just repeating myself, has been displaying a downward trend since the early 1990s. And the fourth panel depicts the political regime characteristics during the apartheid regime, 1970 and 1989. The apartheid started earlier, right? We know that, folks, but my data starts in 1970. The transition to a non-racial democracy during the 1990-1993 period, and then the stabilization of universal democracy from 1994 onwards. And the picture is coming now, what I wrote here, in case you already have the data or some data, in addition to plots, you can also show the descriptives. The mean, the median, standard deviation, number of observations, those tables that we have seen in all the papers that we've been covering in macro and also in research methods. And here is the picture. The first panel there is government debt. You see there isn't much of a trend, right? It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up again, but it's around, hovering around 40%. Okay, it's going through the roof now because of the pandemic, right? And then this is income. We can see here that from early 1980s, you can see it goes down. It's the grand apartheid, right? It really goes down. So until well, as I said, this increase in income coincides, right? And this is the Great Recession of 2007 and 2008. But the positive trend coincides with the advent of democracies. And this is inflation. And as I said earlier on, the trend has been negative, which is good. And this is polity, right? This is democracy. You can see it was flat, and then it changes a little bit. Well, it changes a lot, right? It's the end of the regime, and then it goes all the way up there, and then it stays flat again. Okay. Let me stop sharing here to see if there are questions. Still here. Okay. So again, folks, actually, let me go back. Let me go back there. Again, folks, if you can have more plots, right? I just didn't put here. I don't want to give you the whole cake, right? That's not the point. I just want to give you some stuff so that you can do stuff. Okay, so you can have more plots. These are just the usual time series of your variables, but you could have, for instance, you could start a new paragraph there and say, and I also get the OLS correlations between, that's what I do in the chapter, right? Between government debt and economic growth and inflation and polity. So I have all the plots before I go into the regression analysis. So that you can already do, right? You can have a table of the descriptives. You can put the descriptives there. You can have more plots, such as the OLS correlations, and then you can talk about those correlations, right? So if there is usually there is a negative correlation, right, between economic growth and government debt. So when economies are growing, debt goes down, right? Because the GDP is increasing in size, and that is government debt. It's a share of GDP. If GDP is increasing, then the debt is coming down. And also because there are a growing economy, there are more people working, more people paying taxes. The government is collecting more, paying, hopefully paying the bills. Okay, so usually we have a negative correlation between economic growth and government debt. And what we expect, as I said, is a positive correlation between polity or democracy and that, essentially because of the median voter theorem, right? Again, I didn't put it here because then I would give you the whole thing, but those are things that you should do as well. More plots, the correlations, and the descriptives. Okay. And then what I put there, folks, the references. I have much more than 4, 5, or 6 papers there, because this is a fully fledged paper. It's not a proposal, but I have there. That's the IMF working paper, which explains the data set. And there are papers there. That's one thing that I will do. I will look at the papers, at the journals that you've been working. So IMF working paper is supposed to be good. The Journal of Political Economy, that's a JPE. That's a very good journal. Chicago Journal of Macroeconomics is published by Elsevier. It is decent. That is the QJE. That is the Review of Economic Studies. Those are all top 5 journals. That is more JPE. That is more JPE. That is more QJE, right? There are some papers by myself there. Public choice is decent. The papers where I publish, the journals where I publish are decent. Journal of JME is top 10. That's an NBR working paper. I was asked to cite some local guys. So okay, back to civilization. That's a World Bank policy research working paper. That's an international organization, is a journal in political science. That's Bill Easterly, right? He only publishes in very good journals. That's the AEJ. I'm just showing you this. That's a book by Hayek, the Nobel laureate. That's AEJ. That's Tully's report. That's JPE. That's a that's a World Bank data set. That's Economic EJ, and that's Journal of Comparative Economics. So you can see there, folks. I'm showing you just to make the point clear that there is no gray literature. That's a review, Rev Stats. That's a book, Cambridge University Press. That's a Journal of Public Economics. And that's a Journal of Public Economics as well. Okay. Just to again highlight the point that gray lit. If I see something gray on your references, you are going to. It's not good. It's not ideal. Okay. Questions, comments, suggestions? No comments, no questions. Is it all clear? All clear? Are you guys still there? Or I'm talking to myself in a monologue? Okay. There is a question here about numbers. No 80% plus if we do a good job. We'll see. We'll see. I never got an 80% in my student life. Yeah, don't remember. We'll see. It has to be very good. Yeah, it has to be very good, Dennis. Good. I think I gave 80s already when I was young, and but now I'm not young anymore. So we'll see. We'll see. You'll see when I get these questions, I start doing something else. You see. Break the cycle. Yes. Let's see. Let's see. Let's see. Let's see. Questions, comments, suggestions. I'll be as fair as possible, folks. That you can rest assured. Questions, comments, suggestions. All good. What I'm gonna do, what I want to do, let me share the screen. What I want to do, folks, next week. Okay, I'm showing you the calendar. So here we are here, the 29th, right? Okay, and that means that we have another lecture next week. Okay, then we have a break, and then we have four weeks. We have the 20th, the 27th, the 10th, and the 17th. Okay, so okay, I'm back. So what I'm gonna do next week before we break, I'm gonna present my proposal, right? Because I will be asking you to present your proposal as well. So I'm gonna present my proposal within 10 minutes, right? I'm gonna organize some fake slides, and I'm going to present my proposal. Then you get, okay, you get the idea for the proposal itself, and then idea for how you should present, and then you are done. Okay, and then we can discuss other stuff also next week, because the presentation I will present in the same way that I want you to present once you start presenting. Okay, so I'm going to use only 10 minutes, and then we can discuss comments or suggestions or questions that you might have, or any other stuff. I'll come up with ideas. Let me stop sharing. Is that all right? Okay, let me, so that is all for today. Let me stop recording here. Let me see. Okay, I'm stop recording now.